Good evening. We're going to start a short series of looking at this book, the Book of Joy, and it's by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And it was a week that they spent together, and Douglas Abrams managed to organise it, and he had a film crew with him. So if you check out the Book of Joy on YouTube, you see some clips between these two great spiritual teachers, very mischievous people as well, the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, and certainly two that are filled with joy. Dalai Lama is obviously Buddhist, Desmond Tutu Christian, Douglas Abrams is Jewish. So we have a real mix of ideas, and Douglas certainly adds a lot to this book and the ideas there too. Now, when we think about joy, we often think quite superficially about things that are going to make us happy or things that give us pleasure. And that's not the sort of joy that they are talking about. They are joys that come from outside that can be quite superficial, and once the outside stimulus has gone, the joy goes too. So this is about a much deeper sense of joy. And it's not pie in the sky stuff. These are two men who have experienced great hardship and suffering in their lives. The Dalai Lama was obviously exiled from his home in Tibet and has lived in India since about 1956, I think. And Desmond Tutu is involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Both have had threats on their lives, and both have faced immense hardships and difficulties. So they do a lot of it. The whole beginning of the book is all about what joy is and the different emotions that we have, fear and anger and envy, but also joy. And both men start with the idea that the innate human nature is to be joyous. So they start by saying that joy is what we are about in every way. And Tutu says that we read so many things of hardships and the horrors that humans do to humans, and we read them and see them in the news because they're newsworthy, because they're not what we would expect. They are out of the ordinary, and we should remember that there is thousands and millions of little acts of kindness and joy taking place all the time, which never make it into the news. And at the end of the book, they say that there are 8 pillars of joy, 4 pillars of the mind and 4 pillars of the heart. And the pillars of the mind are perspective, humility, humour, and they're both very humorous men, and acceptance. Perspective, humility, humour, and acceptance. They're the pillars of the mind. And the pillars of the heart are forgiveness, gratitude, compassion, and generosity. And the ancient mystics would say that the longest prayer is from the head to the heart. And here we have the two sets of pillars, 4 head, 4 heart, which will lead us into joy. And when we think about the way we experience emotions and feelings, we often think that they are uncontrollable. They come upon us. We have no control and no act over them, which is why they start with the pillars of the mind. So there's an old Buddhist saying that with our minds we create our own world. And what we would see here with Desmond Tutu is that we are created as children of God, and that Jesus says that he has come to give us life, and life in all its abundance. So there's that real central idea that joy is at the heart of who we are and who we're meant to be. But we often feel far from joyous. So we're going to start by looking at the first pillar. I've created a wee pillar. So our first pillar is perspective. And what they're saying is if we can change the way we see things, then it will open us up to the other pillars, especially the pillars of the mind. If we can change our perspective, we will have a different outlook on our humility, our humour, and our acceptance. Now, perspective is what some people call it reframing a situation. How can we look at a situation in a different way, which doesn't make us feel that we're getting crushed by it? A couple of little examples in the book. Desmond Tutu asked the Dalai Lama how sad he must have felt when he was forced to flee from Tibet and take refuge in India. And the Dalai Lama says, I don't see it now with sadness. It was hard and it was difficult, but now I look at it and think, if I'd stayed there, I would have been really a prisoner in my own land. I would be in a gilded palace, but I wouldn't be allowed to do very much. Because I was exiled, I can now do so much more. I have met so many interesting people, I have travelled the world, I have spread the message and wisdom that he brings about the joy of life. So he learned to reframe being forced from his homeland into a much more positive way of seeing it. Douglas Abrams often brings psychological experiments or messages from psychologists and sociologists into the book. One he talks about in terms of perspective is two army veterans who had been injured. Both were paraplegics, they'd lost their legs, and they were visited in hospital. And one was curled up in bed in the fetal position, railing against the world and the injustices. The other, with exactly the same diagnosis and prognosis, thought about his current situation, and he thought that he had a second chance at life. He says that as he was wheeled out in his wheelchair, he was closer to the flowers and he could see his children face to face. Two different perspectives of the same situation. And Douglas talks about driving the Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Tutu, to a meeting in Los Angeles, and they were late, and all sorts of things were happening. And Tutu was driving, and he was cut off by a driver, and Douglas waited for him to explode and start shouting, which is what many of us would do. And he didn't. And Douglas asked him what he felt, what was going on when he was cut off by that driver. And he says, I could get angry, but there isn't much point. So I think, what's happening with that man's life? Is there a family member who's in hospital and he's desperate to see them? Has something else happened in his life? What are the worries and the anxieties? What are the pains that he feels just now? And I ask for God's blessing on him. So we move from what many of us would do, which is about getting angry and wanting to scream abuse at someone, to this very different way of seeing a situation, a different perspective, whereby we actually come to ask for God's blessing on someone else. So perspective is that different way of looking at things. The psychologists might call it that idea of spatial distancing ourselves from the situation so we can see it in a new light. And many of us will have that experience. Maybe when I've had this conversation quite recently with people where folk have talked about their parents and growing up, and as teenagers the frustration and the anger and how they thought their parents were so old-fashioned or just didn't know the ways of the world. But only with the distance of the years, and maybe sometimes a spatial distance between us, can we look back with a new perspective and think, what a lot of sacrifices they gave for us, what a lot of wisdom they taught us. Couldn't see it at the time, but with a distance we gain a new perspective of what's happening. Desmond Tutu would say it's taking a God's eye view, and when God looks down on what's happening in the world, time is in a completely different situation too. A different perspective often involves thinking about other people and what those other people are experiencing and going through. Both the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu are in their 80s and their health is not always good, and they both give accounts of great pain. Tutu with prostate cancer, the Dalai Lama with gallbladder problems, and in the middle of that pain and being rushed into hospital, thinking about those that they passed, and the Dalai Lama seeing people begging on the streets, and again just that sense of what's happening with them, what's going on, what pain are they also suffering, and he finds that as a way of reducing his focus on his own pain. The psychologists have studied people and they have found that those who tend to most frequently use the words I and me and mine, I, me, mine, those who are more focused on what's happening with them have both a higher level of heart disease and a higher level of depression than those who more frequently say we and us and ours. So those who have a more inward way of looking have more problems health-wise. Those who have an outward way of looking have a much more balanced and open health approach to it. We also have within this idea of a different perspective, a different way of thinking about us and our relationship with others. We are interdependent. The myth of us being completely independent and free from others is one that just doesn't stand up. So when we look outwards and when we think about others, we can generate a greater sense of both perspective and a sense of peace within ourselves. So they do a little meditation for each of the 8 pillars, and this one is about a self-distancing practice. So again, this idea of the wider perspective or the God's eye view, allowing us to just take a distance from what might be happening within our own life and thinking about it in a much wider way. So a little meditation, a self-distancing practice. So if you sit comfortably and maybe do a wee bit of breathing exercises, just allow ourselves to still ourselves and come into this practice in a good way. So first, think about a problem or situation that you are facing. So think about what that was or is, who's involved, how it makes you feel, what's going on inside. Often think about taking a weather check of the emotions that are going on. If we think about a problem or situation, what's the weather inside looking like? Is it stormy and rough and dark clouds? Or is it blue skies and sunshine? If it's a problem or situation, it's more likely that we're feeling something more stormy, something more dark. The next is describe your problem as if it was happening to someone else. So in your mind, describe it But don't use the words, this is happening to me, or I felt this. Replace me and I with your name. So use your own name as you describe it. It just gets that sense of distance from the problem. Try that, have a go at just describing your problem, but using your own name. Now try to imagine this problem from the perspective of a week, or a year, or even a decade from now. Will this issue or event still have that same impact? Will it still seem so big? Will you even remember it? What might you have learned from the experience in a month or a year or a decade's time? And lastly, try to witness your life from a God's eye or a universal perspective. See your fears and your frustration from this point of view. And as you do so, now see all the other people who are involved in having equal value, as being worthy of love and respect just as you are. Everyone involved in that situation, everyone who is experiencing a similar situation, is equally valued and worthy of love and respect. What would it take to serve not just you in your situation, but all those other people who are involved or experiencing a similar thing? How might we bind ourselves to those other people and those other experiences? A little meditation on distancing. When we try and look at distancing, it's not to say, well, this is just how it is. This is nothing that can be done about it. We just have to accept it. Neither the Dalai Lama nor Tutu just accepted their situation, but they used the idea of perspective to be able to stand back, to take the anger and the hurt out of it, and rather than being reactive and forceful, they were responsive and creative. They looked at new ways of approaching it. So it's a nice meditation to start, and it is the first one of the 8 pillars. To find a new perspective is like the key that opens up all the other ones. So I invite you to try this little meditation at some point, bringing to mind an issue or a problem that you might be facing, and to explore using this little meditation, if we can step back, almost look at it from outside, or take that God's eye view and think about where we are, plus the other people, plus those who might be experiencing something similar. Our first pillar of joy, perspective, and we'll return next week to look at the next one, humility. I hope and pray that you will have every joy today and this week, and may God's blessing be upon you.